stick a psychopath in a brain scanner, what are some of the things that you'll see?
You'll notice decreased activities in parts of the brain involved in decision making and emotional reactions. Several different parts of the frontal lobe, which is involved in executive functioning, foreseeing future events, the future consequences, decreased volume of brain tissue in those areas, an inability to really feel, to get reward from things that you and I might get rewards from, good movie, friendship, etc. There might be a need to get some kind of stimulus so they can feel. To do that, they may have to do some extreme behaviors in order to get some kind of emotional response.
What triggered it all? I wish I could give you a good straightforward answer on that.
This stereotype of psychopaths making up a large proportion of government, high-powered executives, CEOs, is that a myth or is there truth to that? Dr. Dean Haycock is a neuroscientist and science writer with a PhD in the neuroscience of dopamine from Brown University. He's the author of Murderous Minds, a forensic dive into the brains of violent psychopaths, and Tyrannical Minds, which explores the psychology and neuroscience of political leaders / dictators with dangerous personality traits. It covers a lot of people we've frankly seen way too much of on the news recently. His work bridges cutting-edge brain imagery, behavioral genetics, and real-world criminal cases, translating hard science into gripping narratives that help us understand how empathy fails, morality or conscience breaks, and what factors really produces the monsters we binge with morbid curiosity on Netflix. Subscribe to the channel if you've ever wondered whether evil is born, built, or just quietly working in middle management.
I interviewed Dr. Hare and FBI profiler who were called in to consult on the Columbine killings.
Wow.
They were, absolutely certain that one of the killers was psychopathic. It's interesting about him because he came from a very normal, apparently very healthy family. There was no indication there was any abuse or any environmental reason. The other one was homicidally depressed, and they made a team. This kid just got collections of genes which really resulted in high psychopathic traits, but it wasn't like so many people who are diagnosed with psychopathy who have
Dr. Dean Haycock, what is a psychopath?
Well, part of it depends on who you ask. I don't mean to make it more complicated than it is, but it really does depend on who you ask. There are all kinds of, or I should say there are various methods for measuring and therefore identifying someone who has psychopathic traits. There's quite a bit of controversy with regard to these different methods for measuring psychopathy, but generally, you can say it's someone who has a certain profile of behavioral and psychological traits that are extreme in their case and lead to generally antisocial behavior, not necessarily criminal behavior, but definitely antisocial behavior, where their priority seems to be their own obtaining their own rewards, often at the expense of others and without regard to the welfare of others. But it's a great way to start this interview because it raises so many different questions and concerns that people who seriously study this issue have to deal with. I remember I talked to Dr. Robert Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, several times when researching this, and his concern was that these different methods for measuring psychopathy might not all be studying the same psychological profile.
Right.
And it's a real problem. And if you think about it, you're dealing with human beings, right? And we've got each of those human beings has around, I think, 86 billion neurons in their brain, and they're connected. And if you think AI is complex, it's nothing compared to the complexity of the human brain. And then you have all of the environmental factors that influence the function of that brain, and you have the genetic factors. And it's not surprising that there's so much controversy and confusion about the nature of psychopathy.
Right.
So you have some people use the term sociopath, psychopath, antisocial personality disorder. They can all be dissected or discussed in detail and see their interrelationship. And then there's subtypes. Researchers have come up with a number of different subtypes of psych. And basically, what we have are people who have a certain constellation of traits, and they're not appreciated by other people. And if you have those traits to a very high degree, then we have labeled you, if you're one of those people, as a psychopath, and some people would say sociopath or antisocial personality. I hope that's a useful answer. I'm not sure if it is, but that's how I see it anyway.
No, it is. There's a reason I wanted to start with definitions, right? Because we could throw the word psychopath and sociopath around for 2 hours, but if people don't know what we're exactly talking about, that
Right.
it's an important starting place.
Right.
Am I right in saying that the diagnostic criteria is actually different in Europe and the US? I thought this was kind of amusing.
Yeah.
Like they had too many psychopaths in America. They had to raise the bar. They had to be like, okay, it's from 25 tick boxes to 30 tick boxes. Am I right? I thought that was just kind of hilarious.
Yeah. Well, I noted it, and I thought, that it wasn't surprising because Europe does things differently, and I think often better. And but with scientific research in the U.S. today, 30 in the psychopathy checklist is the cutoff point. 30 out of 40. And in Europe, they lowered it to 25.
Yeah.
In the U.S., if somebody received a score of 25, they would still be considered certainly high up on the scale of psychopathy. And most of us, are probably around 4 or so on that scale. So we'd have to talk to the Europeans who came up with that idea. It's a great question, and I don't know why they did it, or they have that scale. And it is sort of arbitrary, that cutoff. But for science to do a research paper, you have to have defined the variables you're using. So it's relevant there. And they've defined that. So as anyone who reads the research from Europe, in the method section, they'll say they used a score of 25 out of 40 to describe psychopathy.
Right. Is there any data that shows that the prevalence of psychopathy might vary in continent to continent, culture to culture?
My understanding is no. And in fact, in my book, I discuss examples of people who were described in Eskimo communities and in African rural communities. And if you look back in history, you can remember Loki from Norse mythology. Certainly has psychopathic traits. So generally, no. I think, and I can speculate. I think one of the reasons for that maybe is, in nature, there's all different variations, and that's very helpful for evolution. So if something changes, and you have a segment of the population that has a certain group of traits that enable them to survive better under those changed conditions, it's helpful for the species. Well, that's how I look at psychopathy. It's in certain situations in a civilized society, it can be very, very negative, but there are conditions under which psychopathic traits can be helpful. So that's why I think the answer to that question is no. I think you'll find people with this constellation of traits in all societies.
I think because of, I guess, media has imprinted an idea of psychopathology in people's minds. American Psycho obviously being one of those trademark movies, and there seems to kind of be this association in that common media of like capitalism and businessmen and this sort of fearless business leader who, as you say, has maybe those positively selected for psychopathic traits, but that idea of that fearless capitalist leader is very much, an American stereotype and an American cultural idea. So I was curious, were they more densely populated in America? Was there any good data to tease that apart at all?
I don't think so. I would think the answer for that impression is because America just had so much wealth, natural resources, and size, and it adopted capitalism. And capitalism has its prime goal, profit. There's no culture motive in it. And so who are you going to get moving up to the top of a system whose prime goal is making profit, making gains? You're going to have people who are able to manipulate and convince, have charm. And so
if your culture and society rewards those psychopathic traits, you don't think that they would kind of come out more in development? From what I got from reading your book, that the development of psychopaths is in this rich and complicated interaction between your genes and your environment, right? Possibly if psychopathic traits were rewarded more in a particular culture and society, like they might be in a capitalist American society, you don't think they might get more positive reinforcement to be fearless, to be, lacking in remorse or emotion if the situation depended on it? And that might kind of breed, create more of these kind of budding psychopaths, which in a more temperate culture might not have sort of displayed those traits, if you see what I mean.
I do. You can look at it one way. You can look at, psychopathic individuals have been reported to have more offspring.
Interesting.
And a significant contribution to psychopathic traits is thought to be genetic, in combination with environmental influences. So that's one issue there. And the other is it rewarded? I think what you could get under the scenario you just described are people who don't have particularly high psychopathic traits, but are rewarded for being manipulative, say, and for being a bit cruel, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily psychopathic.
Right.
And psychopathy, a key feature is lack of empathy for others, for instance. And then the different tests for psychopathy, emphasize different emotional characteristics, but that's one of the key features for it. And lack of remorse, things like that. But you can get that in people who are not psychopathic too.
So is this stereotype of psychopaths making up a large proportion of government, high-powered executives, CEOs? Is that a myth, or is there truth to that?
No, I don't think there's truth to that. Depending on how you define psychopathy, okay. remember, it's a constellation of traits, and you're going to get a distribution of these traits. And there's a man named Francis who actually he's a psychiatrist, and he wrote one of the early versions of narcissistic personality disorder, I think, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And he made the point, I believe it was in an editorial in the New York Times, that you can have lots of bad traits that aren't particularly nice and not be psychopathic.
Yeah.
Or in this case, I should say, he was writing about narcissistic personality disorder. In fact, you can check off all of those traits that he listed, but if it doesn't bother you, all right, and you don't need psychiatric help, psychological help, he doesn't consider it a personality disorder. It's only from a medical standpoint, he only would classify you as having narcissistic personality disorder if it bothered you so much that you couldn't function. So you have a lot of people out there that are being rewarded, right, by moving up the ladder. But it doesn't mean they're psychopathic in the sense that all of them would have a high score on the psychopathy checklist, for instance.
Right.
You know, you could say as a cliche, it's a dog eat dog world, and that's part of the game. And they're willing to do that to get it. I think that one of the early studies of psychopathy in financial CEOs, et cetera, was 4%. It came up with the idea it was 4% of the people they tested who were CEOs. I'm not sure the very latest research, but I don't think it's going to be much different than that.
That's interesting, though. That is above the population level. Am I right in saying that? So
no doubt about it. Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
That means 96% of them fall below that range too. And of course, we always look, human beings, we evolved looking out for the worst circumstance, right? So if we go out walking, leave our cave in the caveman days, and we're just really delighted at the flowers and the blue sky, and a tiger jumps out and kills us, we're gone. We can't reproduce. But the person that comes out and says, I bet there's a tiger in the he's the one who's going to survive. So we've evolved that way. So we'll look at those 4%, and they will become in our mind often the majority, and they're not. We always have to look at the other side.
Right. Do you think that would be higher than 4% if you were talking about politicians? Because you do kind of there's a list that people generally have with politicians and psychopaths, and you might be able to swap the header on the list and not really be able to know which is which, right? Like there is a certain level of and also it's related to how we elect these people into government. It's not just kind of their traits when they're there, but we make a lot of predictions about how people will act as a leader based on their confidence. And their confidence could be completely false, right? And they're maybe more likely to project this completely false confidence image if they do have a few of those psychopathic traits and they are less grounded and less humble.
Right. I think, I think you're making me think of something that I think is very important, is that I hope in the future we stop using labels so much.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah. So what I think we will see, and what I'd like to see, is more profiles. So instead of labeling someone schizophrenic or psychopathic or however it is, there would be a couple of pages of different psychological traits, and you could sort of have a bar graph and show, and you'd look at these patterns to see, because in the field of psychiatry, many individuals who have diagnoses of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression,
Yes.
and I think it can also be applied to psychopathy too. That there are people in the middle range, and so you have to pick. So I think I would tend to talk more about traits and
Yes.
reserve the label for those really extreme people,
Yes.
the people they write books about, who have or are depicted in No Country for Old Men, that kind of psychopathic character with absolutely no empathy, no remorse.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you. I had Dr. Robert Plomin on the podcast,
Uh-huh.
and one of the godfathers of behavioral genetics. And one
Uh-huh.
thing that he really sort of imprinted in me was how we all carry many hundreds of genes for these different traits.
Yes,
And a lot of these discrete labels that we've put neat boxes around are just arbitrary cutoff points that we say,
absolutely.
oh, you only have 760 genes for ADHD here, but you need 769, or it's so ridiculously arbitrary, and it causes a lot of issues in the healthcare system. And
Yeah,
depression is one example of that, where that's just one label. But there's millions of ways that can present, and we don't know if we're talking about the same thing.
yep.
We just
Yeah,
need more tagging. We need more information surrounding. As you said, we need a profile. We need
absolutely.
a lot more than one label, because we carry all of the baggage of that label, even though it might not apply.
That's absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And one of the reasons we have that, of course, is because of insurance companies.
Yeah, right.
They're not going to pay for treatment for somebody who has a couple pages describing their psychological profile,
Right.
labeling diagnosis, and I don't know how that's going to be solved. I think if psychologists and other scientists eventually come up with good ways to do that, maybe they'll be able to influence insurance companies. But wow, that could take a while.
Right.
But I agree with you.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. I also bought one for my girlfriend, and she also loves it. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep, so this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable. literally is just a really high quality, well-made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally, and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more. In all of your time preparing and reading for Murderous Minds, what shocked you the most? What did you learn that stuck with you?
Well, obviously, some of the degrees of what some of the cases I read about, the degrees of violence in the case of violent psychopathic individuals, but also I had an opportunity to speak to someone who was the prime suspect in the disappearance of a child, and the his behavior was so much like what I had been reading about and being told about that fascinated me. And that might just be a reflection of the firsthand experience of being with someone who I largely suspect has significant psychopathic traits. So I think it was the close-up dealing with someone who was involved, in this case, in suspected of close involvement in a violent disappearance of a child. So it's real. It's very real. And there was another time when, which was way before the book. I was young, and I was in Istanbul, and I was pretty stupid, and I would go walking around the city trying to see things. And I was invited to a dinner by a woman, and I put on my best clothes. And afterwards, I left and I began exploring the city. I was followed by two guys, and one of them grabbed my arm. See, instead of being dressed like I usually was, I had a nice clothes on. And one guy grabbed my arm, and I looked at him and yelled at him to get it off. And I looked at the eyes of his partner coming behind him, and I really saw the eyes of a predator. It was quite amazing, and I was able to get away. But that was very eye opening, and that it was not a human look. He was looking at prey, just the way a cat would look at a mouse or something like that. So I think to see these things firsthand up close makes reading all the scientific papers and speaking to the experts even more impressive, because you learn some of the background for these observations and the things you experienced. Yeah.
Right. I think the nature of psychopathy itself, we kind of want it to be discreet. We want it to be those other people and us, like they're evil. They're in a separate box. There's some level of maybe some of us not wanting to admit those same psychopathic traits and potential to do bad live in all of us, where it does just seem like a different thing. Is there any body? You mentioned the specific people. You detail these cases really well in the book, and they're just fascinating. Is there anybody where what they did just stuck with you and you couldn't get it out of your head for a while, just because the degree of coldness or callousness, violence?
Yeah, there's one case discussed by a researcher at Harvard. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name right now. Where I don't particularly want to just tell horror stories here, but I'll answer their question. But he had tied someone to a tree and was doing horrible things to him and to the person. And later he said something about what his rules were for being nice. And my my recollection of it isn't that good, but the the uh, the contrast between what he was capable of doing and how he would give somebody advice on how to be nice to people was just so jarring and so concerning
Right.
that one really stuck with me. That someone be capable of both of those behaviors. That was the one that comes to mind. Yeah.
Right. It's not particularly uncommon that these psychopaths can just be so utterly horrific in one area, but then somehow have a relatively normal life in other times, right? I think John Wayne Gacy is an example of that, right? Where he just did horrific acts, but I believe throughout his whole life maintained a family, maintained a wife that actively said that she loved him and felt loved. And I hope I'm getting the right name here because that's a big thing if I'm not getting.
Yeah, I don't think that was Gacy.
Important correction, it was not John Wayne Gacy. I was mixing up my serial killers. Who I meant was Dennis Rader, BTK killer, who does seem to have been a good father and a good husband and have a loving family, despite the fact that he was convicted of killing 10 people in quite a brutal manner.
I think John Wayne Gacy was the guy that killed young men and buried them under his house. And I reference some serial killers. Serial killers are not necessarily all psychopathic. Many are. Yeah. Anyway, I get your point. I see your point. But again, we don't want to suggest that psychopathy is equivalent to violence.
Yes.
They're actually the exceptions with regard to what psychologists or psychiatrists would describe as people with psychopathy. Those guys are extremely scary, but they're not that common either. There is something I'd want to mention in this regard. When I was talking to Dr. Hare, we were discussing psychopathic individuals in business, successful psychopathic individuals. And Dr. Hare said that it's to their benefit to get along with others to an extent, unless those people are standing in their way somehow, and then they could try to undermine them in order to move ahead of them and then get on top. But he said to me, if they were truly psychopathic individual and they had to do something horrendous to somebody, they would do it without thinking about it because they would be in that small group of truly psychopathic individuals.
Right.
We've got that. And then we have the others we were talking about who have psychopathic traits, but they may not hit that threshold you were referring to.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to make a distinction between the individuals that get a lot of press and are the scariest, and then this general population of people with psychopathic traits.
Right.
And who psychologists study in colleges. They give them their own surveys and say, okay, your scale is high and I'm going to study psychopathy in this particular population. But now again, we're back to the question we were discussing earlier is what populations are you studying? Is this population of college students? Do the findings in that group relate in any way to the business people?
Yeah.
It all depends on the study. And it's psychology. And psychology is very, very hard to nail down all those different variables. And we have to accept that.
For sure.
A lot of readers don't like to have to accept that. They want to be told this, or they want to read this is the way it is. This is the answer. And it's often not. We don't know. We can list all the things we do know and try to let listeners and readers absorb that and get an impression and hope for further research. But it's not fulfilling to a lot of people. But it's
Right.
something I always stress.
So, something that I've been really interested in recently is inner experience and how people have a really poor idea of their inner experience. You know, there's all these cases of people who think they have a rich inner monologue and then it turns out they don't.
Mm.
I'm kind of curious, do people have self-awareness of their own psychopathic traits? Are people generally self-aware that they might be, maybe, you know, they haven't done a test, they don't know, but from your knowledge, do people have some idea like, yeah, I could be a psychopath, or I definitely think I'm a psychopath? Or
Yeah, well, not long after the book came out, I was contacted by, I would say at least 3 people who said just that.
yeah,
And I have also seen interviews and read accounts of people who have said, I don't have any empathy or feeling for anybody else. Is something wrong with me? And that, of course, doesn't mean that those people have highly psychopathic profiles. There could be another reason why they're feeling that way. But I have, at the same time, I have seen many references to people who were undoubtedly and had been tested, shown to have psychopathic traits, who were curious about themselves.
right,
There was one in particular, I can't remember his name. His nickname was the Iceman. I think I discuss him in the book. And he gave a number of interviews while in prison. And he said one of the reasons was he wanted to understand himself better. So I think the answer to your question is, based on those anecdotes, probably yes.
yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Does psychopathy present very differently in males and females? You know, I could see a critique of this checklist kind of again being very specific on the type of probably male, you know, violent criminal psychopath, but it could miss a very different behavioral phenotype of this, you know, female psychopath.
I did not long ago see one paper which suggested that females with significant psychopathic traits tended to be more manipulative, um, maybe more Machiavellian than males with significant psychopathic traits, and that is probably not too surprising, I think, because I think if you look at the behavior of young females together, you'll see young females are often show a degree of competitiveness with other females in some situations, whereas guys would be more likely to be more confrontational, and the female would be more, according to these articles anyway, more likely to say things behind someone's back or something like that, whereas a male would more likely. Now, that's just, it's almost 1 or 2 papers, so I'm not sure how that would develop if it was studied more extensively. But
But
that's all I've read about that.
yeah, I could imagine it being a field that definitely requires more research to be done.
Yeah, they're doing more of it now. Yeah.
Let's move into
I think the incidence of female is lower too, but that too may reflect the fact it hasn't been studied enough, and it would manifest itself in different ways. And again, we're back to the profile. If we could have these 1, 2, 3 page profiles or longer, we might be able to see those kind of differences.
right. Let's zoom into the neuroscience, because I think this is you highlight the neuroscience of psychopathy so well in the book, and it's so fascinating. So I kind of just want to go step by step here. If you stick a psychopath in a brain scanner, what are some of the things that you'll see? What will you notice?
You'll notice decreased activities in parts of the brain involved in uh, decision making, for instance, and emotional reactions. And those are like the parts of the frontal lobe, several different parts of the frontal lobe, which is involved in executive functioning, um, foreseeing future events, the future consequences, controlling emotion. If you suddenly get very angry and you can say, I can tell my boss to go to hell, but then I'm liable to get fired and I won't have a job, and that I can shut it down. And there are networks between these regions of the brain. And today, rather than thinking that uh, highly psychopathic individuals have particular specific areas of the brain which function abnormally, it's more likely that these systems in the brain, these communication pathways in the brain, are abnormal in some way. And most likely, researchers think it's a combination of genetic influences and environmental influences on development. And so the regulation and the recognition of certain emotions are not as they are in people without these psychopathic traits. And these centers, which seem to show up with lower activity in brain scans, or like I said, the frontal cortex and the limbic system, the parts of the brain that are highly involved in emotion and regulation. And that is pretty consistent in their findings. There's still questions, about the interpretation of these imaging studies, but it's quite reproducible, and that's the key thing of science.
Yes.
One of my and other people's pet peeves are a single study comes out and it gets a headline and suddenly it's truth. And of course, until it's reproduced, it's not science. It's a report. It's science, but it's not verified science. It's not reproduced. But there have been multiple studies for years and years showing these differences. And there's also in some of those regions decreased volume of brain tissue in those areas, controlling those. And you can see how that could affect the pathways that are present, essential in the brain for controlling the complex behaviors that humans have. So it's pretty well established that there are biological bases for big influences for this. And it's kind of interesting here because I interviewed Dr. Hare and a FBI profiler who were called in to consult on the Columbine killings.
Wow.
Remember, and they were, absolutely certain that one of the killers was psychopathic. He wasn't yet 18, so strictly speaking, you'd have to say he couldn't be diagnosed as being psychopathic. But again, I have to make a point that in the American Psychiatric Society, there actually isn't a diagnosis of psychopathy. It's antisocial personality disorder, which they say is the same as psychopathy and sociopathy. And now we're back to the question of definitions and what is. But they were convinced he was. Both of these experts said it was. And it's interesting about him because he came from a very normal, apparently very healthy family.
Right.
And I'm sorry, it's been a while. I don't remember which name. I think it may have been Keybald, and there was another.
Was Eric one of them?
Yes, I'm sorry. It's been a while since that book, and but the other one was homicidally depressed, and they made a team. sort of. And the one that the experts told me was highly psychopathic came from a fairly normal family. There was no indication there was any abuse or any environmental reason. His brother was honorably discharged from the military, and yet he, from teenage years, and I don't know about younger years, but I wouldn't be surprised, showed these psychopathic traits. And so it's a balance. It's believed to be a balance between the genetic predisposition to psychopathy and it's possible in a case like this that this kid just got a collections of genes which really resulted in high psychopathic traits without significant. Of course, we don't know everything that happened during his youth, but it wasn't like so many people who are diagnosed with psychopathy,
Right.
or who have clearly been abused in childhood, by their parents, and physically, emotionally, sexually, and if they have this predisposition, then they go on and develop significant psychopathic traits. So it really is there's a range. It's like, how many genes do you get that predisposition you, and then what's their interaction with the environment? So at one extreme, it may be, I'm speculating here, but based on the evidence and for what I was told, it's possible very rare individuals can get dealt a selection of genes which really, really have a high chance of manifesting themselves as psychopathy. And in others, it's very possible the person could have some psychopathic traits, but would grow up in a loving household with great deal of support, never feel they need anything, and he'd go out in society and function pretty well. He might not be the nicest guy to strangers or something, but he would be a normal individual. But if, let's say, he had a twin brother and that twin brother or sister had been abused terribly, then you would see this manifestation of terrible psychopathic traits.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a mystery. I was going to bring it up later on. In the cases where there isn't trauma and there does seem to be a supportive family, yet they still go on to do something so horrific, almost all of the population can hardly believe it. Like, what's really happening in those cases? You think it's just a bulk. It's the worst gene lottery you could possibly ask for.
That's my speculation. And if that's the case, then you have these brain systems, these pathways in the brain that aren't functioning the way they do in you and me. And the result is this lack of empathy and also an inability to really feel, to get reward from things that you and I might get rewards from, good movie, friendship, etc. And there might be a need to get some kind of stimulus, and so they can feel. And to do that, they may have to do some extreme behaviors in order to get some kind of emotional response. There has been some recent research that suggests that psychopathic individuals, and again, we have to know which type or which population of psychopathic individuals can feel empathy, but they may not at a certain time. Like afterward, they may feel a little empathy. So, it's they're making more progress, but generally there's a huge deficit in emotions and in control.
How predictive at different ages are brain scans? If you didn't know any information about the human being themselves, you don't even know their name, their environment, but you got the best brain imaging equipment in the world and took every angle, everything, and then you threw all of that into a model, how predictive do you think that could be of future psychopathic behaviors?
Right now, I can only tell you it can't be used for diagnostic purposes. And I can tell you that there are people whose brain scans are consistent with, or are similar to the brain scans of people who have scored high on psychopathy tests, and they don't show psychopathic traits. So there's an overlap. If you look at this kind of science, again, we were talking about people wanting clear cut,
Yeah.
black and white thing. And what you get, the shape of a bell-shaped curve, right? And there's going to be overlap there. And what you'll find in this kind of study is, my gosh, if you take a lot of people who have really high psychopathic traits, they're over on this far edge, right? But there's some overlap with people who don't have psychopathic traits, and it's always that way.
Yeah.
And that could be a reflection of what we were talking about, of different populations. And even within a group of people who score 30 on the Hare psychopathy checklist, for all we know, there's variations within that group, and that could account for that. So I think the answer to your question is no, you can't do brain scans to diagnose. And you can do a brain scan and say, hey, this person has the same images as a person who has psychopathy, but they don't have psychopathy. So
do you think and there's a lot of sort of dystopian scenarios, and the neuroethics of all of this is a really important side that I wanted to get to later. But if we did develop like sufficiently high resolution brain imagery, and we could say from it that there's a 50% chance this person might develop psychopathic traits in the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And we knew that some sort of prophylactic cognitive behavioral therapy, there was some sort of treatment there. Like, do you think that's how things could sort of shape up in terms of getting ahead of the Columbine shooters before, it's too late?
Yeah. I'm always careful about predicting things in science. And one of the reasons is, and I'll answer your question, but I want to tell this, because we often can't predict new developments. People who predict the future, people who predicted, we're running out of oil years ago, didn't see fracking, for instance, coming up. So is that possible? Well, I won't say it isn't. I won't. It all depends on the development. Again, we're working with all these different populations, and the concern there would be the false positives.
Right, exactly.
You would really have to show me data showing 99% or something, because as I said, there are people whose brains scans are very similar, and you can't be treating them for something that they're not going to develop. But it is a very interesting question. I think in the book I referred to the movie The Minority Report about predicting future things, and that's like that. I think we're quite some ways from that. Quite some ways from that. I mean, look at the lie detector test. It's used by intelligence agencies all over the world, but it's not scientific in any way. I had a friend who was in the SAS, and he told me after every mission, they would be given polygraph tests, and they just routinely got through them, cheated on them, because there are ways. It's just not scientific. And so scientific biological test of behavior is really at a primitive stage right now.
Yes.
Because of the complexity.
I also really could not imagine anything more invasive than saying a 12-year-old child has to go in and get their brain scanned by some sort of central government, and they're going to have information on all their pathways in this hyper-resolution futuristic imagery. Like that, that also violates a few privacy laws. And I'm not even a big privacy guy, but someone having like my literal brain and be able to make predictions on that, no, not comfortable about that.
George Orwell, all agree on that.
Yeah, right. You mentioned there how reward pathways are different. I think this is a really interesting direction to go. I understand that you also studied dopamine in the earlier times of your career.
That's right.
Talk about serotonin and dopamine signaling as main neurotransmitters in everyone's brains, how those systems work differently in psychopaths, what we know.
I'm not aware of a lot of studies specifically of those neurochemicals. I do know that there's something which the press labeled the warrior gene, which
Right.
is monoamine oxidase A, and that enzyme is less active, has been shown to be less active in certain individuals. And that enzyme inactivates catecholamines like serotonin and dopamine. Okay. And so in that case, there would be too much of those neurotransmitters in different parts of the brain. Now, obviously, the brain's so involved and so interconnected. Increases in a neurotransmitter in one area and decreases in another area, it would be very complicated for us to apply to certain situations. But the interesting thing about the MAO is there's also a variant of that gene which is hyperactive. I'm sorry, yes, it's hyperactive, just the opposite of the quote warrior gene.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, that's correlated with depression.
Right.
Whereas the version that is inhibited has been associated with greater aggression. And again, the presence of this gene is, and that manifestation of violence is known to be influenced by the environment again. So
Yeah.
I can't answer your question specifically about the pathways involving these catecholamines and psychopathic traits, but there's strong suggestion that those particular and of course there's such important neurotransmitters brain are involved. But for the details, I can't tell you more than that.
Yeah. I have an interesting statistic here which backs up what you said, which is that low activity monoamine oxidase A variant is actually pretty common in Western males. So about 33%. So very common, usually harmless. But if you combine monoamine oxidase L with severe childhood abuse,
Right.
then you get a 3 times greater chance of violent convictions by the age of 26. So again, showing like it's not nature versus nurture, right? That's the wrong framing. It's nature and nurture. It's always the interaction. Cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, there's some very few monogenic diseases, right? Where there's one gene, almost always it's from an interaction between the gene and the environment.
Particularly with regard to behavior.
Yes.
Right. But we did mention there's very rare cases, you and I both discussed, where a child grows up without an abusive thing. And so again, we're in this situation where you have the majority of things can be described, but there's always going to be these outliers.
I would reckon, I'm curious on your thoughts, that even in situations when there was no major traumatic event, there's still gene environment interactions, right? So like there could have been some early radicalization on that it could just be their internet activity, right? When they were 11 years old, they go onto the internet and find the wrong rabbit hole of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traumatic event that you can point to and say, there it is.
Point. That's a good point. And I haven't heard that mentioned before. That's a very good point. Because if these, you could say there's some genes that are going to result in that behavior and others that give you a predisposition to that behavior. And seeing some things, that's an experience, that's an environmental influence. I think that makes a lot of sense. That really should be looked into. Okay, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Let's talk more on, because I'm not sure but that the average listener has a very clear idea of how genes can impact behavior. Because genes code for proteins. Proteins are molecular machines. How can you give one or two examples of how a molecular machine could impact something as high level and complex as behavior? Like just even an example so people can understand that.
Well, if I answer this properly, I'll win a Nobel Prize.
Right. There's definitely some gaps.
No, and I'm not in line for a Nobel Prize, but I can. It's a great question, and I can address it. So we know that behavior is related to structure and function in the brain. And how do we know that? Because if you get a stroke in a certain part of your brain, say in a frontal lobe, in the medial frontal lobe, for instance, or in other places, you can develop psychopathic traits. You can develop them. And just the way if you get a stroke, in the left side of your brain, your language may be affected. Okay, that's a physical thing. But the point is, and I can change your behavior by giving you drugs that affect the neurochemical balance in your brain. So we know that behavior, however it is produced by this mass of tissue and chemicals, is manipulated by a variety of different things. Now, the reason I said I'd get a Nobel Prize answer is because I can't tell you how this massive brain creates consciousness or behavior. Nobody can do that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of theories on it, but so I have to stop below the Nobel Prize and say, okay, we know that this tissue can do this. What can affect that tissue? That's all we can do there.
Yeah.
So, is that partially answered to your question? I forget the first.
No, for sure it is. I just think that the average listener might not have the clearest idea of how you go from something like a tiny machine that has a function within a cell all the way to some sort of behavioral phenotype that you observe, like extroversion or confidence. There's lots of things that happen in that pathway all the way up.
Crucial question. Yes.
I had a really interesting podcast with a political biologist called Dr. Kevin Smith, and he gave me a really good mental model for this, where there's lots of genes that might just impact what you pay attention to. And what I've learned is how important attention is between you and sculpting your environment, because obviously there's so much things going on that we just don't pay attention to, we don't notice, and hence it doesn't have any impact on our development. But if we're just slightly attuned to pay attention to different things, then the interaction with that thing can kind of feed forward on itself, and we can continue to do that. If we just, for some reason, pay a little bit more attention to sport, that could change our whole life, because we just pick up the racket and said, oh, this is great. From 3 onwards, you play tennis your whole life, which is what happened with me. But if just that attentional change in those very early critical moments of development can have very big impacts on, his whole idea is that, and what that podcast was about, was that your political ideology is a lot more heritable than you might think, which was a really weird concept to me. Why would being conservative, be related to your genes in any way? That's just a belief system I have when I'm 30 and old and cranky. Like, surely that's not related to genes. But it does seem to be. And the way he said it was like, well, maybe you just have your attentional system is slightly tuned. So I think there's so many ways that your perception can be shaped, I guess, which dictates how your gene environment interactions unfold as you develop, I guess, is the point I'm making.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I haven't read the original papers on the genetic influence on political attitude, but I have seen reference to that a lot, and it does raise the question of free will.
Yeah,
which is very interesting. But getting back to your question, I'm very interested in your question of how this develops, and it raises the question of how machine-like we are. Right?
Yeah,
we're responding to things because our sensory organs are taking this information, and then it's being processed in the brain, and then the brain is giving an output, producing an output. And you've raised the question of how determined that is, and nobody knows the answer to that. It raises the question of free will,
right?
And you're getting into the parts of neuroscience that we cannot explain. That's
right.
That thing. And so, actually, Some people think that the study of consciousness is not really a good subject for scientific investigation. But today there are more neuroscientists who are considering it. And there are different theories, a lot of different theories of what accounts for it. But it's such an early stage. We can just talk about it, and it won't mean that much really, because it's all theory now, and we don't know how it works. So I really can't answer your question. It's the ultimate question.
Yeah.
Science. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's the most interesting topic in the world, and I hope neuroscientists aren't discouraged in studying it, even if it does seem like an academic black hole a little bit.
Well, they are. There actually are now meetings of philosophers and neuroscientists together, getting together to discuss these ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I've spoken to a number of philosophers on the podcast who believe consciousness are fundamental. People like Anil Seth and Peter Godfrey Smith, who think consciousness is biological. People like Dr. Robert Prentner, who's a colleague of Donald Hoffman, who believes the conscious agent theory, that we construct the universe around us because we're conscious agents. Anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole of fascinating areas, but I love all of it, and it's a big topic on the podcast.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, I go with the biology part.
Me too.
Because of my background, but
me too.
Because we can change consciousness with medications, drugs, psychosurgery. We're all directly affecting that brain tissue, and that is changing our idea. So to me, it's pretty straightforward, but I could be corrected, and I'll keep an open mind as the data comes in.
Do we know the mechanism by which a developing child, when a traumatic event happens, what's happening in their brain from that point onwards that either flips on those genes, or the interaction between those genes and that traumatic event? Just talk around that a little bit. Like, what do we know? What's happening? What do we not know?
Well, again, it's speculation. If you look at the fact that the brain is still developing in a child, and some researchers reported that the pathways in the brain aren't actually complete, involving the frontal lobe until age 26 or something, I've read. Right. So you have this. It's a very plastic brain, right? It's changed in a young child, and these pathways are still developing. And then you come in and you shock it with abuse. You can easily speculate or imagine how these pathways could be altered, either not developing fully because of the stress that's produced. And stress is, obviously is a biological phenomenon.
Yes.
And the connections that are formed in the brain. So it's easy to speculate how interacting in a negative way with a developing brain could affect its growth and the connections that are formed. And those connections could affect the future production or ratios of neurotransmitters in the brain. The connections between the frontal lobe and the limbic system and the amygdala. It's just possible. It's so easy to think of ways in which stress could do. As far as studies showing with the age at which that happens, I'm aware of nothing like that, because these children are in these homes isolated where this happens. You can't abuse children to study them in a laboratory. And so I think that speculation is the best we can do as far as the details of how. It's an interesting question, of what specifically is happening to these poor kids.
Have you seen the Netflix show You?
I don't think so. It sounds familiar, is why I hesitate. Maybe I heard about. Can you, if you describe it?
It's really good. So the main character is sort of this obsessive stalker who's almost certainly a psychopath, or how psychopaths are generally purveyed in shows. Okay. And he sort of has this romantic obsession with people he finds on the street, and then he conducts all of these utterly horrendous acts to protect them, and all part of this fantasy he has with this romantic lover that may or may not know he exists at this point.
No, I
Is
haven't
that
seen it. Okay.
how does love, like, do psychopaths find love? Do they feel love in the same way that, if they don't feel empathy, how do they feel romantic love? Or has this sort of relationship been studied?
Um, just from my impression of talking to some of the people that study it, it's a matter of control for people with extreme psychopathic traits. This one guy, and I'm sorry I can't remember his name now, but be able to easily identify him with his nickname. His name was the Iceman, I think, because he was supposedly so cold-blooded, and I discuss him in the book.
Right.
But there was a time when he had been doing, some terrible things, obviously, and he had a family, a wife and daughters, children. I think one was a daughter, and he would abuse his wife. And during one unpleasant encounter, his daughter, I think, approached him when he had left, and he said to his daughter, if I had to kill you all, you were the one it would bother me most to kill. So,
Holy God.
yeah. So, that's how he saw it. There, if he had to do that to protect himself, say, no question he'd do it. But his favorite child, would bother him a little bit. So, in this extreme case, that's was his idea of love. In his extreme case, telling his daughter that it would bother him the most if he had to kill his family.
It's a crazy story. I
And
guess something that's just hard. So I was going to say, just hard to study in the lab, I guess, like how you really study psychopaths and romantic love and affection.
well,
I don't even know how you do that.
well, again, we have to. The instance I just recounted is the most extreme. Okay, these guys are in the extreme end of this. All right.
Yes.
So you're going to get others with these things, and there have been serial killers, for instance, who maintained relationships. Ted Bundy, had relationships, and so it's a different dynamic. How much, quote, love was there? I don't know. We can only go back to that constellation of traits,
Yeah.
and describe them that way. But I can't answer the question about love the way non-psychopathic individuals would experience it.
Yeah.
I doubt it. Yeah.
Towards the end of the show, which you absolutely should watch. I think it's great. Multiple seasons now, more seasons than it should have been possible. But by the end, he sort of multiple personality kind of comes into it. So, and this is like a really interesting thing. How does multiple personality disorder interact with psychopathic traits? Is there overlap in how they occur? Are they completely separate?
Well, it's question. I've talked to psychologists who are convinced that there's no such thing as multiple or dissociative personality disorder. They say it's a manifestation of other conditions. And yet it is described in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So that means there are other psychiatrists who do believe that it exists. And here, I would have to speculate here, if it does exist, and there are indeed different personalities in one individual, then those different personalities, if they exist, would have different profiles. And so now we're back again to the discussion of what the distribution of these different psychological traits is in an individual. And if this condition exists, what does it exist in this particular personality in that thing? I mean, I've seen interesting things saying that the person's handwriting changes in a person like that. So I can't really answer that question other than what I just said. makes sense to me. But I do want to stress that it's a controversial diagnosis. And in fact, some of the early accounts and books about that were shown to be manipulated in somehow, which raised some questions. But again, other psychiatrists are convinced that it is a true disorder.
Am I right in saying that there was a legal case where somebody was acquitted on the basis, or they were found, I think, probably legally insane because they were basically two people, and then the person in the court was claiming that it was their dissociative identity that had committed the murders, and you would see video camera footage of this person with two basically completely different postures and mannerisms, and either they were such a convincing actor that they fooled everyone with video coverage of them, or they actually were in some way dissociating into two people, two selves.
I don't know about that case. I don't know what's happened. I do know neurolaw is a really fascinating topic, and there have been some instances where juries have been convinced, and other times they haven't been convinced. And I'm not surprised that defense was offered, because it's certainly been offered multiple times for people with psychopathic traits. And I have read of some, at least one case where it did influence the jury and it affected the decision, and in others where it's just disputed. It's generally recognized that psychopathy is not the equivalent to insanity. And so a psychopathic individual is generally recognized as having, of being responsible for the crimes they commit. I'm not surprised that that defense of dissociative identity disorder has been raised in court, and it certainly has been raised in the case of psychopathic individuals. And in some cases, the jury has accepted the argument, but in many others, it's been a failure on the part of the defense. It is widely accepted that it's not suitable for an insanity defense, because a person with psychopathic traits knows the difference between right and wrong. And they are not psychotic. They're not delusional. They don't hear things, that aren't there, or see things that aren't there. There's no psychoses. So they are responsible for their actions in that regard. But now these other questions are bringing another dimension as well. This person has very low activity in their frontal lobes and limbic system, and they have fewer neurons in these essential parts of their temporal lobe and limbic system. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, clearly this person has biological features that are characteristic of psychopathy, which manifests itself in certain behaviors, and we can trace it directly back to these changes in the brain, these abnormalities. And that argument's been made several times. Yeah.
It's a really weird one, and it may, in every conclusion, I think, makes you uncomfortable in a different way. How do you think about ethical culpability in the context of everything we've talked about in terms of biological predispositions, in terms of trauma? Yeah. How do you think about this? Because it's murky, it's challenging, it's complicated, and it's weird on so many levels.
Yep, and that's my conclusion.
That's your take.
Because it just circles around. It circles around. This behavior is related to biology, but there's also the understanding that they know that society has criteria for right and wrong. Okay, so you could stop there and say, wait, they know they did wrong, therefore they're guilty. But then you go around the cycle again and says, yeah, but their brain is making them behave in such a way that they're not considering that at that time. They're not considering right or wrong at that, or they don't care about right and wrong. And their brain is making them do that. Therefore, they're not responsible because there's a biological basis for their behavior. It just goes around and round. And wherever you stop in that circle, that cycle, is where you're going to make your decision. So some people are going to say, well, that person did it and they knew it was wrong, so they're bad. And other people are going to say, no, there's a biological basis for this behavior and it's abnormal. There is no answer for it. It's just to consider those factors, I think.
Do you think that, say, someone's arbitrary crime was going to be a 15-year sentence? Would you think that there might be grounds for, instead of it being a 15-year sentence, being a 12-year sentence, or, a slightly decreased sentence on the basis that this person has all of these biological predispositions, and perhaps that does decrease free will in a weird way? There is a less agency. And again, I don't know if I agree with this. I'm just kind of talking out loud and I'm curious. I don't think they should ever be acquitted, right? They should never just be like, you can walk free. And it should never be a case that, they're just thrown in a mental hospital because they don't understand the circumstances. But do you think that even decreasing the term of the crime, is that appropriate?
I don't have a basis for that. I seriously, at this stage, would leave it to the jury, which is not a very good.
But they're consulting you as the expert in this case.
Thanks. Do I think knocking 3 years or knocking time off for this?
Say they just had every single biological predisposition that we have on record. This person, it's almost a miracle they haven't just nuked the world. Let's put it under that frame.
Okay. I think, this is what I would say. I would present all of the data to the jury, and they would have to decide seriously, because there is no answer to this.
Yeah,
Remember
there is no
what
answer.
I was saying, how you want something cut, right? And
yeah.
As a scientist, I would say, what's the data? What do we have? What can we conclude from it?
Yeah.
And again, we're back to that circle I was talking about. Where do you stop? He knows the difference between right and wrong time, or the brain stuff. There's not an answer. In this case, I would seriously have to spell out the data. And what I would do is make sure that a person with highly psychopathic traits could be studied while they were incarcerated. That's not done enough.
For sure.
And so what I might do is say, if they're given a 15-year sentence, and I said, if you cooperate, completely with this thing, and you undergo whatever the latest psychological help is offered to, and this would be the case of a criminal psychopathic individual.
Yes.
And you went through that, you said, then we would consider cutting it down. So it would be conditional. Now,
on a scientific research basis.
On a scientific and treatment basis.
On treatment basis as well, yeah.
Treatment basis. Now, there's not a lot of proven good treatments for adult, extremely psychopathic individuals. For children, there's some promising work going on. But again, these are the kids whose brains are not yet fully developed, and you can change things. But the research goes on, and we years ago it was realized that people with significant psychopathy could function well when they were in a controlled environment. So I think I would would, consider that too in the treatment kind of things. Once they got out, I don't know. Didn't need to do a lot more research whether they would revert back. But generally, it's not like there's a treatment for an adult with significant psychopathic treatment. The people are working on them, and I'm very hopeful. We tend to just throw them in prison in the United States and have them interact with other people and teach and pick up new criminal skills, I guess.
Yeah. Again, I agree with you that there isn't a right or wrong answer. I just think they're interesting conversations.
They
There
are.
was one, there was one case that you write about in your book, and I've actually made a video on just by complete chance, which is this Alex, the school teacher. So this 40-year-old man who doesn't commit a single crime in his life, wakes up one day and is suddenly sexually attracted to children.
Right.
And sort of time goes on. As I remember the story, he doesn't act on it and immediately is kind of concerned by it actively and is a bit horrified, what the hell is going on? I've never had this my whole life. Apparently, I don't know if weeks or months go on, I don't know the exact timeline of him resisting any urge to act on it. He eventually does act on it. He's tried for molestation. He's kicked out of the family house, and he's kind of like, what's going on here? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't me. I don't feel in any way related to this. So he goes to the hospital and says, look, check my brain. There's something up here. And they find an egg-shaped tumor pressing up against, I believe it's the orbitofrontal cortex, a region that has some regulatory control on sexual social behaviors. He does the surgery, takes the egg-sized tumor out, and all the urges go away. Literally overnight, they're all gone. He has no urges. And then he's like, wow, okay. He checks himself into rehab himself. He has all of this, remorse about doing what he did, feeling what he did. And then that's not the end of the story, though. Time goes on, the tumor regrows, and the sexual attraction comes back. And I'm like, that's one of this is one. And then apparently he got the surgery again. It went away again. That's a story that I read, and I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. That's good. I don't know what takeaway is from that, but that's crazy.
No, it goes right back to what we were saying about the biological basis of his behavior and desires and thing. The tumor was obviously interrupting function in the brain. Now, the function could have been to suppress. It depends. One factor would be what age child he was attracted to.
Yeah.
If the child was post-puberty, then that child would have secondary sex characteristic of adults. And that's different from attraction to a prepubescent child. And in fact, pedophilia in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is described as a sexual attraction to children under 12. And I think what they were trying to get there is that that's prepubescent, and it's from a biological standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's abnormal to be attracted to a child that is not of reproductive age. It doesn't have the features that males in this case are usually attracted to. But it's different if it's an underage child under the age of 18. So it'd be interesting to see, because one speculation would be he was attracted to certain features, and without the tumor, he knew society, wouldn't allow that. It's wrong. He thought it was wrong. It's poor. It's terrible for the development and the emotional development of the child. So that's just a speculation. So it'd be interesting to know what the age group was he was attracted to. But clearly it was interrupting inhibitions in his, possibly inhibitions. I don't know if you could speculate that it was actually creating a different desire, but it was clearly affecting his brain function. And again, we're back to the biological basis of this.
Yeah. But I think we should protect children with the utmost Absolutely. And I think
Yeah.
obviously child molestation is horrible and we should punish them, I think, to the full extent. But what that case does show is that
Yeah.
there seems to be a distribution of free will to some extent.
Yes.
That person did not seem to be possibly operating on the full spectrum of free will they were the rest of their
Yeah.
40 years. And that's a
Absolutely.
really uncomfortable
Yeah.
conclusion. I'm not really sure what to do with that. Again, I think on almost any other crime I'd think differently. I protect children first over everything. So if the fact that it's
Sure.
specifically child molestation, I'm like put him in jail, no changes. If it was a different crime like robbery or something, I think like a non-violent crime, I would definitely think twice about like giving that person leniency in that case, because they didn't seem to have all of their free will. I don't know another conclusion to come from that
Hmm.
after like waking up and them having these urges they never had before and cravings. And
Right.
it's strange and uncomfortable and murky and weird, and I don't know what the right conclusions are, but
Well,
interesting
again,
to.
I would say the same thing. I think if these people could be studied, um, we could do more brain scans and psychological tests of these people,
Yeah.
and in therapy. That those are the treatments. Now they would be incarcerated; they would not be walking around, but society would be learning
Yeah.
how it might be able to prevent this in others, which you alluded to earlier in the discussion, and how to prevent this person from doing it again. This idea of locking people up and throwing away the key and not learning anything from them,
Right.
embracing ignorance. I mean, there's in exchange for getting your revenge for it. And I agree, these people have to be taken out of society so they don't harm innocent people. But let's learn what we can so we can
Yes.
understand the cause of this pathology.
I really agree with that. We might not have answers to all of the moral ethical questions because it's weird and we don't know enough. But you're right that we should always be aiming and striving to learn as much as possible from these cases.
right.
There was another one. Have you heard of the Texas Tower sniper?
I did. He also had a tumor in
Exactly. That was
boredom.
another
Yeah.
one that like he went to the top. This was in the 1970s, I believe, or something. I could have the dates wrong, something like that. And he went to the top of a tower in a university, and this footage still exists online. It's quite grim, and just started shooting as many people as possible. And I think he was either shot by police or shot himself, but he had a suicide note that basically said, check my brain, something is not right. Like I'm
I've
so
heard it.
angry all the time I can't control it. So there's
Yeah.
something wrong with me. And it turns out he did have a tumor. I believe it was somewhere in the frontal cortex. I don't know the exact region. And again,
Yeah.
he shot lots of people. So I'm not saying he should be acquitted, but again, it seems like he was in a state where he had at
Right.
least less free will than someone else. And
Right.
that's
Yeah.
how should we be characterizing free will and putting that into the calculation on term length? I don't know if that's possible, but it's just one of those. It's like a fact that we can't ignore as well, or I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. No, no, I did hear about that too, the person who left a note. And again, these are specific examples where there's a correlation between a brain abnormality and behavior, which hasn't been, demonstrated before. And it just goes back to the argument that neuroscientists make that we are our brains, that's the source of our beliefs and our hopes and our dreams and our actions and our insecurities and everything else. And if you mess with it, or if nature messes with it, it affects it and changes it. There's one thing I wanted to add. You made a comment about you brought something up which made me think of something that I thought was very interesting. You had said that we want to learn about the value of learning from these people who harm others. There's a famous a movie about the Holocaust called Shoah, which
I haven't
interviews
haven't
survivors
seen it.
of the Holocaust, and it was like the definitive documentary about the effects and the survivors. And the director, the creator of that show, absolutely insisted that people do not try to explain Adolf Hitler's behavior, because he felt any attempt, any diagnosis, any label put on Hitler would excuse the behavior.
Yeah.
And he insisted that that never be done. And I've heard this argument before. And in another book I wrote, I said, you can understand that from an emotional level, but we have to understand to try to prevent it in the future.
Yeah.
So there's a little battle between our feelings and what we can do to try to, and both sides have valid arguments, but I pick one side over the other, which is understanding, so it doesn't happen again. Yeah.
For sure, I'm with you. If you could wave a magic wand and do any experiment or research with an infinite funding on psychopathology, what big question do you think we haven't answered? What's the most interesting thing in the field that we haven't sunk lots of money or experimentation into?
What I would do when I was early in my career doing research, I thought, this was decades ago, how great it would be to follow people when they were healthy, to when they were old, and to look for signs in their brain for Alzheimer's development, for instance. Now, at the time, it was so early, but since then, people have been doing that. Well, I would do the same thing with psychopathy and also other mental conditions, psychological maladies, anything that was bothering people. Just follow people with brain scans, if you could, psychological tests from young age to adulthood. And I think that's what I would most likely see, to look at the changes in a large population of people, and then to pick out things worth further study and see how things are developing in people. And that's not infeasible to do with enough money.
Right.
Of course, in this country now, science is
getting defunded. It's not a good place for scientific funding in America at the moment.
Yeah, so this is fantasy at this time, which is insane, but that's where we are. But the answer to your question is, I would like to see long-term studies of the development of psychological features.
What about neural implant technology? Do you think this gets really like my kind of Suicide Squad? I don't know if you've seen that movie where they implant the brain chips in the criminals. Imagine a psychopath could take a 10-year sentence instead of a 20-year sentence, but it meant they needed to have a neural plant implanted inside their brain, and then we are able to learn as much as possible from their signals. That's a strange one, but I think maybe justifiable.
Well, that's interesting. That would be volunteering for a neuroscientific experiment if it could pass the ethical review board.
That would be the hurdle.
I would certainly consider it, as long as it was ethical. Yeah,
right.
Consider that.
Yeah, it's a weird possibility that could be the case.
It could be. Again, I'm not one to judge the ethical nature of it, but if someone were to take that responsibility from me, then I would look forward to see that.
You'll take the more data and the more information and see what we can do with it.
As long as no one is hurt.
Yes.
I would take it. Now, that also brings up an interesting question. Remember, the Nazis performed horrible experiments, for instance, like freezing people and judging. And then there was a controversy. We could use that data to help people, for instance, who fell into the ice, because they would literally put their victims in ice and study the physiology of them there. So it was a huge question. Do we throw that out because it's inhumane experiments, or do we use that data to help people today? And again, it's an ethical question, just somewhat related to that. So
For sure. It doesn't feel entirely productive to throw it out, though, right? I mean, it's horrible that it was done, but it doesn't seem like you gain anything back from throwing out data that could help people. Data you're not likely to get again for obviously ethical reasons.
Yeah. But yes, and I can see this. One, I can see both sides. I mean, it was such a horrible thing to do. We just don't want to condone it in any way. And
Right.
what if, I'm arguing from the other side now, what if we used it and then another authoritarian dictator came along and said, hey, that gave useful information.
Right.
Let's try it again. So if you just throw it away and put those people on trial, maybe it'll discourage it. So there's, again, you raise the most interesting questions that don't have black and white.
That's what podcasts are for, right? Just long form conversation where two people are scratching their heads without any clue.
It makes it, to me, it's very interesting. And I hope listeners will not be frustrated by the lack of this is this way and this is this way. And that's the end of it. Because frankly, guys, that's not how the world works.
They're used to it they're used to it on my podcast. I speak to neuroscientists every week. So like the neuroscientist has never answered a question without saying, firstly, we don't know.
Good.
So like they're very used to not strong answers on things and lots of nuance. So this has been a great conversation for all of that. Absolutely.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, I enjoy it.
Let's finish off. This has been so much fun, Dean. I've learned so much. I think you're a great communicator. Thank you so much for coming on. If you made it this far, then you must at least partially be interested in brain science. And who can blame you? It is the most interesting topic in the world. Twice per week, I talk to the most amazing neuroscientists in the entire world. So if you're interested, then subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below who you'd like me to speak to next. And thank you so much for your ongoing support.